The thief laid a hand on the cold iron gate and peered through the bars. The cemetery beyond lay wreathed in a thick, heavy grey mist. "Open it," whispered her colleague. The thief was nervous. The whole group was nervous. But word was that Barnabas the miser had been buried with all of his gold, and the group were here for digging. The gate opened with a piercing screech of rusty hinges, and the party moved in to the hallowed ground. A sudden owl hoot made them all start, then laugh when they realised their mistake. But the next sound chilled the blood in their veins, because out of that thick, cloying fog came an unearthly cacophony of shrieks, moans and groans as the dead rose from their graves. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're starting our haunted cemetery build. Hi folks, thanks for joining me today. So yes, this is the first in our series of the Haunted Cemetery build, and this is going to be a series of boards, modular boards, that I'm building up for my fantasy skirmish game. No doubt it will be useful for other things as well. So when it comes to terrain for tabletop war games, I think it serves a few purposes. First of all, it makes a table look nice. It adds a lot of visual interest to a table. And if we think about any battle really throughout history, now of course depending on the timescale we're looking at, the terrain might change. Ancient battles, for example, tended to be fought on open plains, or maybe they were contesting river crossings, that sort of thing. If we come up into the 20th century, or even before that, battles could also be fought in urban areas, in heavily forested areas, and so on. So, of course, as wargamers, this gives us license to create all sorts of great terrain for our games. So the first purpose is cosmetic. It adds that visual interest. And if we spent a lot of time painting up our figures and everything else, then you want a nice setting to place them on, right? The second thing is, of course, terrain plays an important part in strategic and tactical decisions. Do you have the higher ground? Is the ground you have to cross marshy or muddy? Can you really get your cavalry through that dense forest? And so on and so on. So in that sense, the scenery and terrain we use also informs the way we play the game, the particular tactics we're going to use. Thirdly, and particularly for some type of games, terrain gives an element of cover for those poor soldiers who are facing enemy fire. Now, again, in ancient times, this wasn't such an issue maybe, but of course if we get into modern warfare, particularly with the improvement in firearms, then no one is going to be marching forward into machine gun fire in lines anymore. People are going to be looking for cover. This is particularly true with skirmish games, which tend to be in a very confined area. I mean, some modern skirmish games you play on like a 3x3 table, right? So everyone is literally in each other's faces. And I've noticed the thing with a lot of sort of 28mm in particular, World War II rules, they don't really do range anymore. You might have close range or short range, and then everything else is just counted as within range. Because if you're playing on a 6-foot table and you're firing a rifle, well, if you can see it on the table, you can hit it. So in those cases of being under fire, but also for questions of stealth and being seen and hidden movement, terrain becomes very important. And also, of course, terrain can become an objective in itself. There were many battles, certainly in Normandy, for hills. It was an advantage to get the high ground, so there were battles for various hills. It might be, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to capture a river crossing in order to be able to advance your army, or even to keep your supply route open. And of course, throughout history, there's numerous battles fought for crossroads or for strategically important towns or other geographical features. In skirmish games in particular, I think this becomes even more of a feature because generally skirmish games tend to be more narrative based. You're operating with maybe 20, 30 figures. It's more personalised in a way. You don't have these sort of massed ranks of faceless figures. Each figure is an individual. They may even have their own stats in terms of smaller skirmish games. And that then brings in this narrative element, which means, of course, there are very clear and set objectives. This idea of objectives is something I'm very much working into my fantasy skirmish game because, as I mentioned previously, this isn't going to be side A and side B. This is going to be side A, B, C, D, E and F, much in the line of Fistful of Lead that Ove has been running recently. And again, something I've been wanting to work into for a while is this idea of multiplayer games, multiple objectives. So for that, we need to have a good setting. We need to have some specific terrain. And I thought, what better setting for the first fantasy skirmish game than the Haunted Graveyard? So this has to meet a few requirements. First of all, it has to be transportable. I could make in my shed here a 6 foot by 4 foot board, but I'm never going to get it in the car. So that's the first consideration. Second consideration is it's got to have some very recognisable features that will work as objectives. So there could be some crypts or mausoleums, there could be a church in the centre, there might be a spooky forest section, there could be some particular graves or monuments, there might even be some sort of weird altar or portal at one point as well. So each of these might form an objective for each specific player. In the example we gave at the start, we have a group of thieves who are basically coming to dig up old Barnabas and see if his gold really was buried with him. There might be other groups with the same objective, or the local watch might form another group and they're going to be on patrol and alert to any attempts at grave robbing. The next requirement is that the terrain has to be playable. So this is where we move into this compromise in wargaming terms, because if you were doing this as a diorama, you imagine an old neglected graveyard, say on a model railway set out, you're going to have your gravestones and everything else, but then there's going to be lots of vegetations. Perhaps you'll be putting in overgrown hedges and brambles, lots of foliage here and there, that kind of thing, which looks fantastic, but it's very difficult to place the figures on. So we always have this compromise between how it looks and the practicality of using it. But that is my next requirement, is how it looks as well. Because let's face it, we could throw down just a piece of cloth. I could use some little blocks or counters for graves. We could use a sort of box or a tin like this or something. There we go, that's our church. So, you know, it's very functional, but it doesn't really look that good. And one of the things, if you work in a narrative game, particularly if you're doing RPG as well, is to be able to create that atmosphere. So in that case, the terrain becomes part of that atmosphere building process. The first thing I did then was to make a list of the terrain features that I wanted. And as you'll see, I've got some here already. So I've got a church that we've seen before. Of course, we've got our Esoteric Order of Dagon building. I'm not sure that's going to be suitable for this, but that's certainly going to be used in the future for something. And I've got a lot of scatter terrain here that I've been buying, tombstones, gravestones. I've got some other bits and pieces on the way, the cemetery walls, the iron gates, that kind of thing. And in terms of the crypt or mausoleum, I'm going to look at building a couple of those out of foam board. Once I've got some ideas for the terrain features I want, the next step is, okay, how am I actually going to base these things? So I did find in the depths of my shed some offcuts. I've got some large pieces of wood. I've got 3 of these. So these are a good size. I can get a lot of stuff on there. The only issue with these potentially is transport. That's quite large to get into any sort of box. I do have some larger crates that these may go in. And of course, if it necessitates a visit to my favourite shop, B&M, then, well, that's a bonus. So I've got 3 of those. That's one possibility. But then looking around on Tinternet, I found these. So this is plywood, 3mm plywood, 30 centimetres square or a foot square, and I got a pack of 12 for 20 quid, which, given the price of plywood and other wood at the moment, I thought was pretty good. Now, these aren't going to fill the whole table. I'm probably going to set up a 6x4 to give us a little bit of space to manoeuvre, but the cemetery will be the central part of the table. So maybe across the whole table and perhaps 2 or 3 tiles this way as well. The rest of the table will be conventional terrain. I've got some very nice twisted, haunted trees, so we could have a forest in one corner perhaps, and we'll have the usual hills and roads and that kind of stuff. I can't imagine I'll put too many buildings in because no one's going to live that close to the haunted cemetery, right? But we'll get a few other features in. The main focus though is that central area. This is where the action is going to be taking place. This is where we need those objectives to bring all the groups in together. And this of course is where we're going to need some cover, whether that's from arrows or crossbow bolts, or potentially fireballs and the like from the magic users. In terms of layout for the boards, I do want to keep this modular to an extent. However, of course, the cemetery does have to have a perimeter. So those outer tiles will have the walls or railings and a couple of sets of cemetery gates. It's going to be an old cemetery, so the wall's going to be crumbled in places. Basically, the players will be able to enter from any side, pretty much. I've hung around a few cemeteries in my time, particularly when I've been shooting my Innsmouth excursions. So I've got a pretty good idea of layout of both the huge cemeteries that we have in London, but also the local little village graveyards as well. And generally you find it's quite similar. There'll be a central path with your monuments to each side. At some point there'll be a sort of clearing, and you'll have your building in the middle, whether that's a church or crypt or a mausoleum. Now, as long as I keep those paths lined up with the centre of the boards, then to a large extent the middle of the graveyard will be modular. I can move those pieces around as I need to. So that's it for today. That's it for part 1. As I said, I'm going to start mapping out the layout. I may even draw in pencil on the actual boards themselves. That way I can experiment with a few different layouts. Stage 2, I'll start working on actually building the terrain, getting the ground cover on and getting all those monuments in place. From there I'll go on to building the buildings that I need to do. That's something I've not really done before, but I've got some foam board, I've got some other bits and pieces. I've been looking at some really good YouTube channels on making your own buildings, so I'm looking forward to having a go at that. Then finally it'll all be put together, it'll all be painted, and fingers crossed it will be ready for the new year, ready for our first skirmish game down at Bedford Gladiators. Thanks for watching, and a big thanks to everyone who has subscribed. I see we've gone over the 300 mark now on subscribers, so I'm really pleased with that. My next aim is to get that up to 500, so if you haven't subscribed already, please do. It will really help the channel to grow. I'd be grateful as always to hear any comments or suggestions you have, or let me know if you've built your own haunted graveyard. I'd be very interested to hear how you did it. Okay, take care, and I'll see you next time.